Hey guys, I'm going to be releasing a new video super soon about one of the most popular marketing psychology topics, which is colors. Until then, I wanted to share this video of a live Q&A I did with Tyler Hakes, who runs Optimist. Optimist is a growth-focused content marketing agency, and they are awesome. So I talk about conversion rate optimization, I talk about my background in growth marketing, how I went into conversion rate optimization, different psychological principles, weird, right? That affect the way that we behave as humans, how I learned those lessons, how different spaces that I've worked in handled different psychological barriers, how we overcame those barriers, and how we found success. I also talk about how you can get into CRO, a few things that you should look at, and some easy trials that you can start testing right away. So I hope you enjoy, and I'll be back soon with a new video on color and marketing psychology. Thanks.
Cool. Well, I'd love to get into it. So, I know you have a couple different projects and companies and things that you're running. So, maybe the best place to start is to just get a quick kind of rundown on your background, your experience, and what you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think similarly to you, and I think actually one of the reasons I initially reached out to you, I don't even know, a year ago, 2 years ago, maybe, probably 3 years ago, actually, at this point.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Which is mind blowing. I guess 2020 is just a blur. But very similarly to you, I mostly started in the startup world. I say mostly because I did a little brief stint in sales for a bit, and then I actually want to go back into marketing and just explore that world. So started at a company called Rally Point. They are a social network for the U.S. military, and that was just a crash course in the startup world. And that's for a few reasons. One, because the founder and the CEO, he was a big time Marine, and he was very, process situations. I want to follow these. I want to make sure that we are always, moving as quickly as possible and just really measured about everything we do. So I think I got really lucky actually in that aspect, because sometimes startups are kind of a Hail Mary where you don't really know, let's just try this, let's do this, let's do this. But we had sort of that structure that was good, and it made me start being obsessed with process and following the data. So I think that was a great little first foray into the startup world.
That's just like super interesting that like kind of that military background kind of collides with like kind of the lean startup or like growth hacking, kind of mindset. In those, they feel very different, but they kind of converge.
Exactly. And it was really interesting to learn about so much of the military. I am not, or I was not familiar with the military at all. And I learned so much just from the structure of the company. And then obviously it was also a company that was focused on the military. It was like a Facebook meets Quora meets Reddit for the US military. So it's, they run lean and mean, and they always have goals. And what was interesting to me, and even just learning from, about marketing and how to apply it in these types of situations, was the way that military structure works is you think about the strategy, and then you think about kind of the operations, and then you think about the tactics.
Right.
It's the same in the military. And I was like, wow, that's the easiest way for me to ever kind of realize and understand. But I started in content, and really we had a lot of great content and a lot of great discussions, and they were very interesting. So I basically was in charge of figuring out how do we use these great tidbits and really start sparking our growth engine organically, right? How do we get people interested in this? How do we get this in front of people? And how do we get people so interested that then they convert into members? Like most social networks, right? The number one goal is to see how many people we can get to join, and then use that various monetization. So started there, figured out kind of, how do we get these organic conversations to actually turn into a growth engine for us. The conversations were fantastic. So I have to say I didn't have to do a lot on that end. Like the content actual creation wasn't something I had to focus a lot on. It was more like, how do I market this and position this in a way that makes sense, and then make it into sort of a funnel that is easy for people and they want to join. So started organically, and then they basically were like, hey, Kanika, can you now take that organic process that you're using and apply it to paid? So then I actually ended up taking over all user acquisition. So I took over all the B2C And then my marketing partner took over all the B2B. Used the same process and said, okay, this is the positioning, this is sort of the process that works. Let's put some, let's supercharge this thing and put some ad dollars behind it. So we were able to, boost that community from about 400,000 registered users when I joined, all the way up to 1.3, in about 12 to 14 months. So that was just really cool to be part of, and I learned an insane amount, an absolute insane amount. And again, like I said, conversion rate optimization was such a part of that.
Right. What were there any like specific takeaways there that you remember now, like this thing really worked well, or this was like a lever that we pulled that was really effective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like I said, I think it really got me very interested in conversion rate optimization, and some of the things that worked so well as we scaled was a lot of what we're talking about, and a lot of what and most really good marketers know, is you need to really get into that mindset, and you need to really understand that end user to be able to scale effectively. And for us, it was a challenge because we were collecting 7 points of information. So to become a registered user, you needed to insert 7 points of information that were relatively private. And our audience was relatively private people. The military is already kind of personality-wise sometimes a little bit more private, but even beyond that, if they're not, they're trained to be more private. Don't tell people stuff about you. That's not what you should be doing. So we had to find a way to make them feel comfortable, to make them want to give that information, and to provide enough value where it's worth it. So a lot of it was, positioning and different formatting, and really seeing where are those drop-off points, and how can we make them more comfortable with this.
That's super interesting. I think we're going to talk about copywriting in a little bit, and I think like that probably plays such a big role into it. I think a lot of people, tend to fall in one of two camps. Either like they're all in on copywriting and they kind of agonize over getting copy just right, and then there's like people who are just like think if I just put words on the page, like it's fine. Maybe it could be better, but like it'll work fine. But I think in a situation like that, copy especially is probably such an important factor, because you are speaking to this very specific audience of people, and you really have to convince them that you understand them and and that they can trust you, right? Which is
exactly
so important.
And for that, actually, we ended up adding an extra step into the conversion process, which helped us scale beyond belief. Without that step, it actually was a worse process, which is very counterintuitive for most people, right? Like the quickest path to getting that registration is the best way to go. And that's not always the case. And in that extra step, we actually qualified people a little bit more. We said, stop, if you are not, X, Y, or Z, then this isn't for you. And that really helped us in a really big way. So it's a lot about positioning and copy, just like you're saying. And there's such a big difference. This is one of those things that I harp on all the time. There's a really big difference in direct response or conversion copywriting versus content copywriting, or even just being a good writer. Sometimes it's like, you can make things sound really good. You're really talented, but there's a certain psychology behind conversion focused copywriting. That's again where kind of my obsession with that became.
Yeah, I really want to dig into that here in a moment. I know when you and I first met, you mentioned Inspired, which is you were there running growth there. You want to talk a little bit about your experience with them and kind of what that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent a number of years with Rally Point, and like I said, that's a social network startup in the social networking space. And I was pretty convinced that there was very few verticals in startups that were harder than social networking. And I was wrong. And the fintech space is a tough space. There's a lot of money in it for sure. But day by day, even today, it's getting more and more saturated by the minute. There's a lot of variables and factors that you can't control as much in fintech, which is tough. And is deeply, deeply personal. So, I'm sitting here saying there's military folks who are very private, and they don't necessarily want to tell you things like their security clearance or their, level or their branch, things like that. People like you and me, we don't want to give our social security number on the internet to, for a financial product. That's crazy. And so we jumped in there and I said, okay, let me do a fintech next. So I headed up growth for them. And it's a very cool company. They're still around. They've pivoted a little bit. I still work with them here and there, but what they focus on is helping people do great things every day. right? And I think in 2020, it's become even more necessary and just more relevant in our everyday lives. But they allow people to basically spark donations to good causes using the things that they do every day, using the purchases that they buy every day. And they're all free, which was something that really drew me to it, right? The whole kind of category is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And for you, say you went and bought a coffee. At the time, we had a debit card that linked to the card that you typically use. So you go to Starbucks, you buy a coffee, you pay $5. You still only pay $5, but if you used the Inspired card, we would donate, a certain percentage of that on top to a charity, either of your choice or a charity that we were partnered with. So the idea behind it was, hey, live your everyday life and do good. Learned a lot from that as well. And, for good companies are very interesting, and, they always have the best of intentions, and they always have, an underlying cause that's very much worth it. But when you're marketing and you're doing growth for good, it's very, very different, right? We want to make a difference. We want people to know that we care as individuals, as consumers, right? I want to say, hey, I want to make a difference in the world. I really care about X, and I'm going to support that with whatever I do. The truth is, and what we learned very quickly is probably, actually, let me relate this to sharing. You probably know this way better than I do, but a lot of the reason that people typically share is more about what that says about themselves than actually sharing that information.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of conspicuous consumption kind of a thing.
Exactly. And when it comes to for good type of companies and things, we realized people in the privacy of their own little lives, they're not necessarily going to go out of their way to do good when the alternative is something that's going to benefit them, right? So same thing with sharing something. Sure, I might be sharing a cool piece of information. Maybe that helps you. But the number one reason that I'm sharing is because sharing this says something about me. Mm-hmm. So we started out trying to position and say, hey, do good with everything you do, make the world a better place, all of this stuff. And that didn't really work that well, right? Especially when it comes to money. It's a lot like, you probably have a credit card that you get points, and you can either, I don't know about you, but maybe I'll use me. I get a credit card where I get points, and I can either donate those to charity, or I can get cash, or I can, get something out of it. How often do I donate this to charity? I'll admit it, pretty much never. I think I've done it twice.
Right.
And that's just how most people are. And it's nothing, I don't blame people for that. That's just how we are as people. So it turned into, how can we really play off of this and make you understand this is what it says about you. So it turned into feel good. That's the intangible, tangible benefit of being part of this community and using our product is you're going to feel good. Therefore, you're going to look good.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating because there's just like a kind of a deeper connection that you have to make there. You have to really kind of dig beyond the surface level.
Exactly. Especially when it comes to fintech. Like fintech is so boring, right? It's like, okay, cool. It's a card. It's a card.
You might have an angry mob after this video comes out.
Honestly, if they can't admit it, they're digging. Because I mean, if somebody's going to be, especially if you're going after, anyone from the age of say 20 to 40 at this point, it's like, if I'm going to be scrolling through a feed, if you're using social or something to acquire your users, if I'm going to be scrolling through a feed and I see a card product versus like, people partying or people having a good time, I'm going to keep going to that. I'm not going to click on this card product. And that's part of the things that we tested is we thought we had to show this, sexy card we had. It was a beautiful card. And honestly, the technology behind it is incredible. I'm still obsessed with it. But no one cares. There's certain people that might care, but that's going to be like a % of a % that cares about that versus people who are like, nice, I'm going to feel good about this. I'm going to look good doing this. Great. So the example I just used, a picture of a card versus people going out, getting drunk, doing good, or going out, getting drunk / feel good, or going out and getting drunk. That resonated more. So it's, how can you turn boring fintechs into something less boring? It's just digging into, what do those people actually care about?
So we just learned an important lesson there, which is that if you're going to go get drunk, you have to do good while you do it, and then you'll feel great about it.
Exactly. keep that in your pro tips for life, and you'll be great.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So yeah, so I mean, obviously in both of these roles, it sounds like you really did kind of a pretty broad range of activities related to growth and marketing. And I think now you've kind of narrowed your focus a little bit more to CRO. You want to talk a little bit about that? Maybe about what draws you to CRO specifically, or what makes you kind of focus on that now?
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're dead on. I think being part of a startup, and especially when you're part of small teams or early startups, you're doing a lot, right? So, I know about SEO, and I know the basics of SEO because I had to try to do it, right? And same thing with Google Ads and all these various things. Is I wouldn't consider myself a deep expert in a lot of that, but I know enough where I can understand the mechanics of it. I can understand why it works, why it doesn't work. Are there little levers that are maybe not super deep into it, but that make it work better? And I think all of it was really interesting to me, but I was always very fascinated with CRO, because once you get kind of that top of the funnel, right? Once you get past the first click, there's just this whole element of, for me, competition. So I was an athlete my whole life. I'm now very washed up. But what CRO really allowed me to do was constantly compete against myself, or sometimes other sites, but really in those roles, competing against myself every day. What are these things that we can do to consistently make maybe our volume higher that's going through the funnel, or what are those things that we can consistently do to decrease our bounce rates? Is just one of those things where you can really kind of obsess about it, and you can just compete, and the better you do, the more it does for the company as a whole, right? And it's something that is very sustainable, which I really appreciated, because you typically own everything post-click, right? Like that whole process after the click is yours, versus as a lot of media buyers know, and as we know, Facebook can do whatever they want at any time.
Right.
And Twitter can do whatever they want. Pinterest, all these other companies can do whatever they want at any time, and they can make your CPMs just skyrocket, which is happening now and happens around the holidays. Like to get a click, are you paying $100? Probably. So those are things that always change, and you can do years of work and perfect it, and then it's gone. And then you move higher acquisition funnel. So the thing about CRO, though, is if you can diversify, and if you can get good at driving traffic to those specific pieces of whatever your product or service is, then you own the rest. And if you can consistently improve on that, then it's more predictable. You know that, hey, for every 10,000 people that come to my site, it's very likely that I'll get X percent of them all the way to the end, and doing whatever that conversion event is. And for me, that's one of those things that you need to be sustainable. And I've seen so many startups, especially small businesses, they just kind of burn out. And it's like, that could have been prevented. You're just focusing on other things. Yeah. It's not as sexy. I will admit that. Like, advertising is really sexy, and that's where I started. Even when I took after the content stuff at Rally Point, I went straight into paid acquisition. And it's really fun, and it's really sexy, and it's like definitely like, oh my God, you're constantly fighting. But it's sustainable at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, I think too, like that's a challenge that a lot of, especially startups, they run into, right? Is that like they make one channel work, and it's working well, but then when they try to either enter into new channels, or again something changes, maybe new people come into the market and it drives up their ad costs or whatever, and now they're kind of back to square one, right? And so, to your point, I think like the CRO component of it is just so critical, because as you said, you own the whole thing, and like if you can make that funnel work, and then you can drive traffic from a bunch of different channels, you can really start to diversify. And so I think I've seen a lot of startups where they get their initial traction, like, again through Facebook or something, and then when they they raise money or whatever, and now they try to scale it across new channels, and like it just doesn't work anymore. Right.
And it is like they're coming through specific journeys, and you always have to take that pre-journey into consideration when you're doing CRO work. So it's not like if I was using Facebook primarily and now I'm only using Google Ads, it might not be exactly the same, but it's going to be a lot more similar than probably the actual performance between the Facebook ads and the Google ads. And it's easier to tweak because you understand sort of those levers at that point. So it's just better.
One of the things that you mentioned, obviously when you were working at the startups, you were doing CRO on top of all of the other things that go into marketing and growth. And I think that's a challenge for a lot of people, is that I might look at the sort of competitive aspect, as you mentioned, and I want to come in every day and kind of beat my previous best. But I think one of the things that a lot of people struggle with in real life is that they just get distracted. They don't have the bandwidth to really stay focused on this conversion rate, and they don't get they don't have the luxury, I guess, of waking up every morning and saying, all I care about is making this conversion rate better, and I'm going to think about that all day, and I'm going to keep working on it and chipping away. So do you have any tips maybe from your experience of how you balance that with all the other million things that you have to do as you're running marketing?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's tough. And I think that you're dead on with saying that's a luxury, because it is, and especially when you have a small team, or even when you have a big team, you have certain metrics that you have to hit month over month, especially if you're venture backed at that. And you have to be running on this treadmill all the time just to hit kind of those baseline metrics. In what world are you going to be able to start trying to test different things without being scared that you're now using your budget for an unknown versus something that you've been able to consistently hit? So it's tough. I think that's what I'll start with. And when you're balancing a lot of things, it's really difficult to keep the specifics all in line when you have 25 other specifics for 25 other channels and priorities and just things that you're doing. But I would say my tips are: take a step back and take a look at the full kind of funnel. What is your conversion path? How are people getting to that final, action that you need them to take? And Google Analytics makes this very, very easy, right? See where it is, and say that you have your ads and they're pretty honed in, but you're getting maybe a cost of acquisition of $55, but you're seeing that, hey, I'm getting clicks here for $7. Then it's telling you something there, right? Is something is going wrong afterwards, or something's not as good as it could be afterwards, that is making this cost go from $7 to $55, which is normal. Don't get me wrong. That's perfectly normal. But that tells you have opportunity there, right? If I just keep pouring money into ads, and that's kind of the myth that everyone says, right? It's okay, if you want to scale and you want to get more sales, just put more budget into those ads. Right. But at the end of the day, you're putting them into the bucket of your site, and that bucket has billions of holes all over it. So it's okay, let me just pour more money in, and then I'm going to waste more money, and then maybe I'll make more sales, but you're not actually making a better margin off of those sales. And it's just not, again, it's just not sustainable. How are you going to do that long term? You're just going to have to keep running on that treadmill again and pouring more money into it. So, look at your funnel and first see, hey, is there opportunity after the click? There probably is. There almost always is. The truth is every single site has some room for opportunity, because average conversion rates are 1%. So 99% of that money is going out the door. Maybe not 99%. If you can do good remarketing, then sure, you're getting a couple percentages maybe back. But let's say 95% is going out the door. And then, depending on your product or service, just figure out what that main path is, right? If you have one flagship product, for example, what are the different steps in that conversion process? You can see, again, using Google Analytics. And if you don't have Google Analytics or some sort of analytics platform, get one. That drop off is, right? Yeah, there's a point that you can pinpoint and say, wow, there's a very high percentage that are just leaving here, and then focus there for now. And I don't mean to say that you can just look at one piece of the full funnel and then that's gonna make everything better, because that's not true. You have to keep everything in mind when you're optimizing, but you can focus in one area and then see how it affects every other area. Because if you start running, multiple tests and changing all these things, then you're going to probably screw everything up. So don't do that. But focus on the biggest point of kind of drop off or friction, and then make your assumptions, make your tests, use your data to do those things,
Mm-hmm.
and then see how it performs and take a step back. Because maybe if you make a step, if you make a change at step 2, then maybe that change really, really affects step 4, and
Right.
it's not best. So it's definitely a process, but
Yeah.
you gotta start.
No, that's super interesting because I think the key takeaways that I'm hearing there are, first of all, is just having like a kind of a very rigid and regimented step-by-step process. Like, don't go in and try to change 20 things at once and test it, which might seem obvious to some people, but I think, like, again, especially if you're new to CRO and you're looking at, as you said, there's tons of data available to you, and you can say, like, all of these numbers could be better, and your instinct might be to jump in and be like, I'm going to tweak all of these different things and try to make the whole thing work better. But then, to your point, like, it's impossible to say what effect did each of those things have individually, and then there's no way to really piece it back together.
Not at all. Not at all. And you're just kind of guessing. At that point, you're just guessing, and you're not actually getting these insights and takeaways that can help you more down the road, right? So, like, maybe you revamped everything, which in some, okay, that's fine if you need to get a new baseline, or you have a new product, or there's something completely new going around, fine. But after that, you need to see what are these little levers that make a difference, and how do they make a difference? Because otherwise, you're just going to be doing that forever. You're just going to be randomly throwing, spaghetti at a wall. And I think that's what a lot of people think CRO is let me just throw these ideas at a wall and see what happens. Where that's not at all, right? You need that process, and you need to use your data to create these insights that give you this roadmap. And that's really what it is your data will give you this roadmap for growth. It's like, I want to go to Idaho, and I'm in Boston, and you know what? I'm just going to start driving. I know that it's west, and I'm just going to start driving, and hey, that bridge looks cool, so I'm going to take that bridge, and hey, that little side path looks great, I'm going to take that path. And it's like, people do those things when they're just guessing, and you're never going to get to Idaho. And you know what? You're probably not going to get to that specific town in Idaho.
Right.
You're probably actually going to end up in Florida. At that point, good luck, but why? You're just wasting your time, you're wasting your money, and you're just not getting closer to that end goal.
So do you have, I mean, like, what is kind of like the full cycle, let's say, of, like, just say you're starting at square one and you look at the data and you say, okay, we want to start here and we're going to test this particular thing. What does the life cycle look like in terms of starting that test, getting results, analyzing the data, and then kind of moving to the next thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's very individual, but at the end of the day, it depends on volume, right? So if you are somebody who gets a lot of traffic, a lot of volume, a lot of people into your funnel, then you can make those tests a lot quicker. There's always a kind of a baseline number. I would say, like, absolute bottom number to really be able to make a statistically relevant change or hypothesis is you need at least 1,000 people. And that's for like one change, right? Okay. So once you make that change, monitor it, make sure enough people are seeing it so that you say, okay, either that change sucked or that change was great. And then you can either revert that and try something new, or you can build on top of it. Mm-hmm. But you need that volume. If you don't have that volume and you're just making changes, then you're going to say, oh my God, we have a 50% increase in conversions. And it's like, well, you had 5 people come to the site, so nothing. Absolutely nothing. That could be completely circumstantial.
Right.
And it can be tough. There's some people who are like, well, I want to do this today. And it's like, you have no idea what's going on. And you can't just make changes because you know what change worked.
Right.
But, I think the most interesting thing that I've learned speaking to a lot of companies is they have no idea what their conversion rate is.
Yeah.
It's one of those.
That baseline data is like a battle half the time, right?
Absolutely. And it is just not spoken about. Conversion rate optimization is not something, it's like that, like, it's like the little ignored child in the family. Where, like, maybe they're a superstar, maybe they're going to be a celebrity, but they are just pushed into the corner. And
I think it's so funny. I think like a big part of that is, unfortunately, is like ego. It's like an ego, but like, it's like, John in marketing wrote that landing page, and like, he's a great writer, so it must be good. Right. And like, if we start testing against it, then we're indicating that we don't have faith in John as a writer. Absolutely, and that's tough. And I think same thing with design, same thing with like general format,
Same thing with even like development, right? Like, no, this flow for, this actual sign up process is the best, or, these features that we've added in, they're fantastic. And it's sad when they've spent maybe, tens of thousands of dollars building in this little thing that's part of like a sign up flow, but it's actually hurting you. And
Right.
it's difficult to say, oh God, I just waste a lot of money. And, if it were me, I wouldn't have put all that money in before testing it. But you have to, there's an element, you're right, of being able to let go, and you kind of have to, and it's hard. And I think if you're one of those people, especially if you're a founder or an owner of a company, CRO is a good way to start dipping your toes in the water, because I think a lot of these folks learn that sometimes the best thing you can do for your company is to pivot or to throw away an idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to start testing that is doing that with little, smaller tweaks. And at the end of the day, that might help you do that as kind of a whole in a business. And it's a good skill to have.
For sure.
You can't get into it. Actually, I think you just made me think of too, is sometimes you have a conversion flow that's really good, right? And you're just like, I don't even want to touch this. Like, this is great.
Yeah.
In some instances, like, okay, fine. Like, if you're happy, then okay, but you're still throwing money away, right? It could always be better.
Right.
And that's when it gets really, really tough. It's like, this is working really well, and to get big results, sometimes you have to test really big changes, and that's scary. That can be really, really scary, and it goes back to your luxury. You don't have the luxury of testing big changes sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Yep, that's always the interesting thing about marketing, I think, is that half the battle, I feel like, is selling marketing to other people and selling the changes and the ideas and the things that you want to try or what you think is going to work, and that's always a big part of it.
Absolutely. CRO is good. CRO is very data driven though, which makes it easy, right? And again, it's like people think it's throwing spaghetti at a wall, or it's this weird black voodoo magic, and it's
Yeah, no, that's what I assume it is.
in my off time, I sometimes practice witchery.
Witchcraft, yeah. Cool. Well, that's an awesome primer here. I want to dive into kind of the specific case studies that we came in to talk about today. So you shared two specific examples with me. One used CRO specifically to drive a 35% lift in sales, and in the other case, there was a 95% decrease in cost of acquisition, which is just mind blowing. So first of all, I just want to start there. Maybe can you just give us a quick primer on each of those cases and what that was like?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with the 95% lift, because dear angry mob who might come after me, the 95% decrease in cost of acquisition was for the fintech, and it was very much based on not being boring. It was very much based on understanding and meeting the user where they are. So cost of acquisition for fintechs, typically, especially in the banking space, for example, that's upwards of $300, $400, right? Like Amex, Discover, all these different companies, they'll often give you $150, $300 welcome bonus if you refer a friend, things like that. So for sure, like being a marketer, for sure that their own cost of acquisition is higher than that. They're not going to give you more money than what they can drive themselves.
Right.
So when we started, we were seeing about the same thing, and then we used CRO and all the little levers and pulleys to decrease our cost of acquisition very, very significantly, as you know. And then the 35% lift in sales was for Hook on Phonics. And yes, they exist. Number one company that I get, hey, I know them. They're still around. Yes, they're very much around, and they are thriving. But the same thing is that was kind of a more direct process, because it was really their flagship product. And they had a pretty good baseline. This is actually a good example of, they had a pretty good baseline. It wasn't bad by any means. It was pretty solid. But they needed to make it better just so they could get more volume and then ultimately increase their lifetime value. And to do that, same thing, we use the CRO process. It was, I say it's more simple because it had less kind of steps involved for the user, but it's the exact same process. And yeah, so that's a quick overview of both of them. Which one's the best one to jump into first?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, let's just start with the hooked on phonics example. So, to recap for anyone listening, so using CRO, you were able to drive 35% lift in sales for hooked on phonics. Let's just start at the beginning. So, did you have like a specific goal when you were brought on there, or what was the initial discussion like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so like I said, they had a really good baseline. And for them, it was pretty straightforward. They had a flagship product. They had exactly where they were today and where they wanted to be, sort of. And for them, where they wanted to be was just better. So our goal is always, let's make sure that costs are covered for this initial project, and let's make sure that you are increasing your margins over time repeatedly, going from there. So kind of like a loose answer for sure. But it needed to be meaningful and significant enough to cover all of their advertising costs plus project costs, and then be able to, get that gravy on top going forward for forever. So sort of a hard goal, but it was more, let's increase this by as much as possible.
Sorry, I'm getting Is that generally kind of what a goal will look like for you? Is just like, we want to do better?
It depends. It really depends on the product. It depends on, again, the different factors like lifetime value. So there might be a flagship product, but their lifetime value for e-com specifically is really crap for that product. So it's like, do we continue on with that flagship product, or do we choose another one that has a great lifetime value or better margins and figure out how to get that, again, better? But typically we'll have a goal percentage. It really also depends on whether it's ongoing optimization or if it's more like a, hey, let's do this kind of one-off, and then we'll look at it again in 3 or 4 months. And that's often dependent on kind of the size of the organization, the resources that they have in-house, those types of things. So kind of people who like to analyze the data but don't really know how to make the changes themselves, they'll often just do, hey, let's make this better, and then we can come back later. And those are bigger organizations. Typically, they have so much going on that it's like, yeah, this is a huge win for us if we can do it once. We'll make it later. But then there's other companies that are like, okay, great. Once we see this initial lift, we want to keep doing this for long term. And again, yeah, you just want to make it better, but typically you want to have some sort of goal, right? And that's again tied to margins. That's tied to lifetime value. And what kind of maybe end of the year goals do you have, or what kind of monthly revenue goals do you have? For sure.
I'm Kanika, so I'm going to mute you while I ask my next question, and then I'll unmute you. Okay.
Sure.
Cool. Awesome. So I guess going back to the kind of the process that you laid out before, right? The step one sounds like it's to really look at kind of the full funnel and really identify like where is the best place to start. And so my question is, going back to the hooked on phonics example, what was that like, and what did you uncover in kind of your initial analysis, and then how did you decide where to start?
Yeah, for sure. So again, they had a funnel they were already using, and for them it was a pretty simple funnel to be able to digest, and we were able to identify that there was just kind of a lot missing, and that was really the process of user discovery and figuring out what are their awareness levels. What are their friction points? What are they wondering? And that's a very all-inclusive process, right? Where it's, hey, we need to know from you as the business what is happening that you know of. Hey, let's look at your FAQs. Okay, well, none of this is covered here, right? Let's look at your awareness levels. And I would say that's probably number one, is what do people actually know when they get to this point? And are you communicating that well? Are you displaying that in a way that's quick and easy to consume, and who are you speaking to, right? If it's a bunch of parents, for example, they're busy and they just want to know what is in this for me, why should I use it, how much does it cost, how does it work, all of these things. So it's certainly a process of figuring out, okay, where is that person, and how do we answer these questions? What are the most important questions to answer? What is sort of the hierarchy of answering those questions? And then how do we communicate that, right? And that goes back to what we were talking about with copywriting and conversion copywriting is you can make it sound really good, which you should, but you also need to add those sort of cues in there that makes them want to take action. So I don't know if that answers your question super, super well, but it's kind of a whole process where we're able to identify these are the top needs that we need to address for these buyers. This is the way that we need to communicate it, because it's kind of that natural either thought process going through it, or it's just very unclear right now. So we need to just give it a little bit of structure, and then we need to figure out what amount of that information is correct, right? And sometimes people always say, hey, shorter is better. You always need to make it shorter, and that's the way to go. Or like long is always the way to go. But at the end of the day, and I think Eugene Schwartz always says this, that there's no exact amount of copy that always works for everyone. And the way to figure that out, and really the best way to describe it, is the perfect amount of copy is the amount of copy that explains what you're selling or explains exactly the value, right? And that's what it is. So it's really figuring out that balance.
Yeah. It sounds like you really kind of use almost more of a qualitative process, or at least a qualitative plus quantitative process with Hooked on Phonics to understand really more the user and kind of the psychology rather than looking at just the data.
Absolutely. For them, they had, it's very dependent, right? It's like they had a steady number of users that typically hit this process. They had their kind of top of the funnel or their pre-click activities pretty zeroed in, right? They were getting good numbers and metrics there. And really, like, the biggest drop off and the biggest point of friction was that next step before somebody makes the purchase. So why is that happening? Why are people clearly interested in this? They want it because they're getting there. What's going on here?
So really, it sounds like you use the data to inform, like, where's the drop off first, and it's that kind of second step from what you're describing, and then you dug deeper into really like the psychology to try to understand why.
Right, exactly that.
Okay, that's awesome. And so then maybe talk a little bit about the process that you use to maybe uncover insights about the customer at that point, and then applying those to the actual CRO process.
Right. So with Hooked on Phonics, sometimes you have the luxury of being able to speak to users and speak to customers or prospects, and sometimes you don't. And honestly, it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the time to get this up, and their goals and budgets, things like that. In this instance, they had a lot of history, which was good to go off of. And so even though we didn't get to speak to users, which is great, we were able to see kind of what was the number one questions that you always get. And thankfully, a lot of the people on their team have been there for a number of years. So they had good insights that, surprisingly, but also not surprisingly, weren't really reflected in their actual marketing efforts. So what are the top questions that you're getting all the time? What type of people are you speaking to? And then sort of diving deeper into it, right? Is, surprisingly, we get a lot of people from these geographic locations. So then we can dive into that and say, okay, people in these geographic locations, typically this is maybe their education level, this is their income level. So then you need to sort of cater your flow and your funnel and your communications to those people. And that's not to isolate or make it only specific to them. But if you know that, hey, 75% of our people are coming from the Midwest and they're generally high school or associate degree level educated, and their income levels are $50,000 or less, then you kind of have a little bit of guidance towards how do you communicate, what do you need to answer, and what's most important to them. And then you can sort of bucket them, right? Are these impulse buys? Maybe not. In this case, it's not an impulse buy.
Right.
Are there complicated things in the process or in the product that they really need to understand? In this case, surprisingly, sort of. And so, are there big hesitations, or are they these big alternatives that people could go to easily?
Right.
There are a lot of hesitations, and there are alternatives, but they're probably not as good. So let's communicate why they're not as good.
Right.
It's a lot of these little questions that you have to ask about why is the person not taking action, and why is the way that we're currently communicating not working, and then filling in those gaps from there.
So can you share any kind of specific examples? I mean, I know you talked about a couple different things there, but maybe like the ones that you remember kind of having the biggest impact.
Specifically, I would say a few things. A lot of people for Hooked on Phonics, exactly, and before pandemic, there's a lot of different options to help your child do better in reading, or not even, they weren't necessarily better options. They just felt easier, or they felt more kind of all inclusive, right? I could just work with a tutor, for example, or I could do this myself. I know how to read really well, and I know the mechanics behind what works. And so part of that for us was debunking those things. So, as a parent, unless you're an educator, unless you're a teacher, you probably don't know those specific tools and those things that really make a difference to your child and helping them read. You can guess, and maybe you can Google a little bit, but you won't know how to handle a situation if your kid just gets super frustrated, or if your child just cannot understand. You don't know those things, and you can actually do more damage. So our whole goal there was to explain that very succinctly. I can't even say the word. This is actually the definition of what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Explain that to them in a way that makes sense, in a way that is letting them say, "Oh, you're right. That could be actually horrible for doing."
Right. So kind of positioning Hooked on Phonics versus sort of alternative solutions.
Exactly. And that's very normal, right? But it's digging into what are those top alternatives that people do. Where are you hearing as a company? Where are you hearing that people are either writing reviews about and saying, "Oh, I did this instead," or I think I'm going to try this, or I was happier doing X, Y, or Z. And it's digging into those and saying, are these actually the best alternatives, or are they not? And if they're not, why not?
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting because I find kind of an analogy here between what we talk about a lot with content marketing and sort of mapping content to the different stages of the funnel. And really, I think what you're describing is like kind of extending the landing page or kind of whatever page they're seeing to kind of the bottom of the funnel, right? Where the bottom of the funnel is like, I'm comparing A product versus B product, or I'm comparing, this potential solution versus that potential solution. And so by addressing that, you're kind of moving them one step further in the funnel, at least in my world, that's the way I would think about it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I mean, you can get with like CRO and creating these high converting landing pages, you can get super granular in exactly what you're saying. You might have a completely different landing page. You probably do, or you should have a completely different landing page for bottom of the funnel versus top of the funnel, because there's different pain points and questions that you have to answer. At the same time, if you just don't really either know where to start, or you don't have the resources to do it, or if sometimes they kind of all have the same sort of questions, or it's not like this really complicated type of thing, you can use something like a long form page. And that's what we did was we were able to hit all the different questions for whether you're top of the funnel and you don't really know a lot, or you're bottom of the funnel. And that goes back to kind of the hierarchy, right? Is how do we describe this information, and what kind of placement do we put it in? And we do everything down to what are the headlines and where do the headlines appear? How do we actually format some of this information? Because we're very cognizant of the fact that there are various different user types, right? And there's not only funnel stages that people are in, but it's also the type of person. Whereas, like I said, busy moms, busy parents, a lot of them are just going to skim, and they're going to stop in the first, if not above the fold, they're going to stop in the first third or the first quarter of the page. Right. Then there's people who kind of want to know, but they're not going to read every single word. So then you want to make sure that the way that you have created the copy, created the design, can still check off those boxes for them as they skim. And then same thing for bottom of the funnel, and then the type of person who wants to read every detail. Those are those folks that are big, bargain shoppers, and they just do a lot of research before they make any sort of purchase. And you want to make sure that you are covering all the bases. You're making sure that you're communicating in a really good way, an easy way to understand. But you're kind of taking them through the journey that they need to understand and what's actually naturally happening in their head, right? It's okay, great, this sounds great, but what about this?
Right.
So you can match that conversation.
Addressing the concerns and things as they...
Right. And, objection handling before they actually object. That's a great thing to do.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And so this is a question making here. So I think another thing that people think about when they think of like CRO are, for lack of a better term, I say like growth hacky types of things like, oh, if I just change my button color from orange to green, like I'm going to see 20% more conversions or whatever. How, if you had to characterize it, or just like off the top of your head, like what percent of the wins that you find are kind of in that bucket versus more of this kind of what I would qualify as like substantial changes in like product copy and positioning?
Right. I would say, some of those things can be nice, and they can be quick wins, and they can feel good, right? If you change the button copy or the button color and you go from green to blue, maybe that makes a difference. Or, if you go from red to green, fantastic. People are going to say you're going to double your conversion rate. You're going to go from hundreds of customers to millions of customers.
Right.
And that's just not true, right? And even getting into color psychology, I'm going to talk about that on my YouTube channel later this week. But there's not a there's not a one size fits all solution for things like that. So even color, yes, there's psychology behind it, and people have done research on emotions and what it evokes, but that's never going to be the thing that takes you from 0 to 1 million. Mm-hmm. What does do that is having that deep understanding of your customers, of your prospects, and knowing how to position that and communicate all of their different questions, all of their different objections really, really well. Right. So I would say, what percentage is a button going to make a difference versus the actual copy and design and communications? Maybe 10% to 90%. It's not a bad thing to do. And if you're just getting started, sure. And sometimes that's one of those things that makes you believe like, wow, I can make these little changes and it does something.
And that might be a good place to start for folks who are maybe like trying to sell the idea of CRO or like kind of prove the value internally. Is like get a couple of quick wins, even if it's like a 2 or 3% lift in conversion. Like you can just kind of prove the idea that these smaller tweaks can make a difference, and then you snowball that hopefully into more substantial changes and research and that kind of stuff.
Exactly that. And I mean, and don't get me wrong, there are sometimes things that make way more of a difference than we would ever guess. And we are very irrational beings, and you could just do the coolest things, and people are like, I'm not having it anymore. And I've seen that happen where we've done this huge design revamp. At one of my previous companies, we did a huge design revamp, and it made everything look really nice and sleek, and we thought more intuitive, and it flopped, and it sucked. But the truth of the matter is that sometimes that's not it. Sometimes it's not trying to make everything just look really, really good. Sometimes you have to take, or often, always, you have to take your actual users into account and say, okay, we might think this is ugly, but they use this weird, clunky design, and that's what they actually prefer, and it's actually better for them. So we had to actually just revert back, and everything, went better performance-wise.
Right. How? So I know you mentioned on your site this idea of like using science-backed strategy and stuff. One thing that I'm curious about, and you mentioned this previously, is like how much do you kind of really follow like a true like scientific method where you're really starting with like a hypothesis and then kind of trying to validate that hypothesis? Is that really the kind of the true approach that you take, or is that just kind of an analogy?
Always. Science is like quite literally the process of studying things and finding answers to the questions, right? And it consists of exactly what you're saying, of creating these testable hypotheses and these predictions, and then hopefully they're based on data, and then running experiments over and over and over again to discover if those hypotheses are correct or not. And that's always the process. I mean, I would say again, with these one-offs, it's based on a hypothesis, and every change in everything that we make is to prove whether that hypothesis is right or not, and it's based on different data. So maybe, hey, people are doing X, Y, or Z, so let's see if that will translate over into whatever changes we make, if that makes sense. It's very kind of high level.
For sure.
And then the hope is, if it's a one-off, they're going to continue to say, okay, great, did these changes accomplish what we need to accomplish? If not, then we need to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what was that behavior? What did they actually do? And how do we now leverage that and take advantage of that behavior to do what we need them to do? So
Right. Yeah. So that's super interesting, because I think, that's something that's easy to skip. But I think when you start with that hypothesis, then, as you said, you're not just like throwing spaghetti at a wall, because you have sort of a qualitative element of it to say like, we think this is going to achieve A because, we think people are going to like this color more, or we haven't previously addressed this pain point and now we're addressing it. And so then whether you prove or disprove that hypothesis, you have at least a starting point to say like, okay, we thought that this was going to help them understand this thing better, and it didn't apparently. And so now, like, what went wrong there, and how can we form a new hypothesis based on that finding?
Exactly that. Or, if there's a lot of, frequently asked questions, and you say, okay, this is the one that we get all the time. Let's address it in the flow. Let's see what happens. And sometimes it doesn't make a difference. So you say, okay, that's interesting. So maybe it's not the data that we do have based on their frequently asked questions. It's something else. So we need to figure out what that something else is and implement it. So it can be, it goes back to your like, oh shoot, I should know this. And it's an ego thing where I do know this. I know my user. I know exactly what they want.
Right.
But oftentimes you don't. You have no idea, and you just have to test them.
For sure. Cool. So I want to. We only have a few minutes left here, but I want to talk a little bit about the other case study that we mentioned here. So it's working with Inspired. You're able to lower the cost of acquisition by about 95%, which is just insane. Again, can you talk to me a little bit about the math behind that? So like kind of what combination of improvement, or what combination in improved metrics culminated in that lower cost of acquisition?
Right. And for us, it was all focused on post-click. So our ads were actually really zeroed in at that point. We had already put in a lot of pre-work, and so we were able to say, okay, we have a really great click-through rate. Our click-through rate is 8 to 12% repeatedly. We're able to do that, and our actual costs for clicks are really great. That makes sense. But for some reason, I think I mentioned this earlier, but for some reason, as soon as they get into the funnel, and again, it was a multi-step process, but as soon as they get there, our costs are just going way high. So for us, it was analyzing the different steps of that conversion funnel and figuring out how to change copy, answer questions, format it in a way that makes them feel more comfortable, and more particularly looking at it as, hey, let's back this up. We have 4 steps to this conversion flow. This one, the first step, maybe we have 900 people in it and 500 people move to the next step. Okay, that's like a 45% drop off. That's pretty significant. And then, from the 500% or the 500 people, maybe we had, 400 go to the next step. That's pretty good. And then from 400, maybe we had 100, right? So that's like a 75% drop off. Right. So then we say, okay, you know what? That's probably our biggest opportunity right now. Not to say that we don't want to come back to this 45% or even come back to maybe, whatever it was, 20%. But 75 is significant, and that's what's making our cost of acquisition just skyrocket, because the only people that are actually getting through are like 25% from the last step, which is probably 5%. I'm not actually doing math in my head right now at this point, but right. Of the people who started, okay, that's a huge problem. So if we can actually get this to 50% even, then our cost of acquisition is going to go way lower. And that's exactly what we did in that point is we were literally asking for social security numbers cold off of the internet. And the question is, okay, so how can we make them feel comfortable, and how can we, do all these different things to make them know that not only is it safe and secure, but it's also worth it for you to do this. Mm-hmm. Everyone needs a value. You need to give me something if I'm going to give you my social security number. Again, a process of making these hypotheses. This is probably not making them feel comfortable, or this would make them feel more comfortable, or this would communicate it really well, and implementing them and then testing it and seeing what actually move the metrics and move the needle.
Right. So it was really sort of all on-site CRO work that really led to that giant decrease.
Exactly that.
Which is super fascinating, because I think like you said, I think there's tons of people out there who kind of beat their ad guys up to death, right? Like trying to get them to like affect the cost of acquisition or the cost per click or like whatever, and bring that down to a penny or whatever the goal is there, but they neglect, unfortunately, kind of what happens once people do click and what opportunities they have there.
Oh, exactly. I feel bad for media buyers all the time, because they're tasked with doing the impossible, and it's like, if they are only focusing on that, again, pre-click behavior, And then somebody goes from, oh my God, this ad is great and it's communicating X, Y, and Z. And then I click through and, oh my God, this is nothing like what I saw in the ad. Then that person is going to leave. They're not going to ever finish whatever they were expected to see or expecting to see. And it's a full journey. And it's like if you only look at one piece or the other piece, you're hamstringing yourself. You're never going to be able to create a cohesive journey for your prospects if you don't see what they're seeing as a whole. And I mean, same thing, even for us, like if we will never not ask, where are these people coming from? What are they seeing beforehand? Because if we can't match that, then it's not going to work.
Yeah. Well, that might actually be your answer, but I was going to just ask, like, what are the most common like mistakes or misconceptions that you see when people are trying to either do a CRO or just even thinking about CRO?
I think one of them that we already spoke about, right, is just trying too much at the same time. They're like, oh, let me just do everything, and it's like you don't know what's making a difference.
Right.
Really, really hard. Other misconceptions again are that it's just guessing. There's a lot of people that say, I go off of gut instinct and it's always great. And gut instinct plays a role in this. Don't get me wrong. It does, but it should never be the thing that you go off of. You need to use the data. You need to be obsessed with data if you're going to do conversion rate optimization well. And then again, looking at it as a whole, like you need to understand the entire business because that allows you to see the opportunities and then also see what's going to actually create that lift for your business, right? If you start focusing on all the wrong things, then you might make them better, but is that going to make your company better as a whole?
Right.
Not. So it's be data obsessed if you're going to do it, have a process if you're going to do it, and think about your users primarily and only if you're going to do it.
Right. Yeah. I think that just a kind of a final thought there, which is that whenever I talk about optimization in any capacity, I always like the first question that you should be asking is like, what are you truly optimizing for? And I think, with CRO especially, but in really any kind of marketing, it's easy to zoom in too far really and get obsessed with I'm optimizing for this specific metric, whether that's like click-through rate or whatever. And to your point, without zooming out and seeing the broader picture, maybe you crush it and optimize this thing and it's 10x better, but it has some downstream effect that actually nets a worse result, in some way, like hey, we're driving much cheaper traffic, but then they never convert into customers later on or something like that. And so when you think about CRO, I think, and any kind of optimization, really, it's you have to think there's usually multiple levels of optimization, right? You're optimizing a specific kind of KPI in like a tactical sense, but you also have to think about the broader goal and what you're really trying to accomplish by improving that number, and look at both of those and really see the whole picture.
I think just a final note on that thought. One thing that sometimes happens actually is you get so obsessed with increasing your conversion rate, maybe for a specific product or a specific offering. And maybe you do that really well, but then you're not looking at the lifetime value. So did you actually increase conversion rate, for example, by offering a huge discount?
Right.
And then getting that discount really well. Right. And then you say, okay, great. Oh my God, our conversion rates are 50%. This is insane, which would be insane. Like we have accomplished our goal 50x.
Right.
But then if you don't zoom out and say, okay, great, we accomplished this goal. What is this doing for our actual revenue and lifetime value? That's not a good thing,
Right.
Go back in and say, okay, so conversion rates are great. Maybe, hopefully you had a process, so you figured out what helped those conversion rates outside of just the offer, and then can you apply them to something that is more lucrative for the business.
Yeah, and of course that can be a challenge, right? So I think it's important as marketers, as growth people, in any capacity to really be looking at a number of metrics and really trying to understand the full impact of everything that we're doing. And I think that's a great takeaway, maybe a good place to leave it.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Kanika, thanks so much for taking the time. I know we went a couple minutes over. Really appreciate you sticking around, and thanks so much for sharing all this awesome information and insight. Where can people find you online?
Yeah. So if anyone wants to find me, betagrowth.com. Beta as in how us Bostonians pronounce it, BEDA. I'm also on YouTube, and I'm doing some cool marketing psychology videos these days, which I'm excited about. So wherever you find me, I will answer. And Tyler, thank you so much for having me. This was super, super fun. Hopefully we can do it again sometime, maybe with some whiskey. And
All right.
Rest of your week and good Thanksgiving.
Thanks. Yeah, you too. Have a great holiday. Thanks again. And thanks all for checking us out. All right. Cheers.
Cheers.